Okay, so this recording is for students of LAS 415. We're going to finish up our introductory lecture about description here, and we're going to talk about some sort of core attributes for description that are shared across different metadata schemas, and we'll look at some examples. So we have talked about how bibliographic entities have a number of different attributes associated with them. Some of those are useful in terms of finding and identifying a resource, selecting it, and obtaining the resource, whereas there might be other attributes that may not be quite as important. So through the creation of standards, we choose to supply the most essential metadata in our records. However, what's most essential is going to vary from community to community, from content standard to content standard, and from scheme to scheme. So to perform resource description, we look at those important attributes of the resource, both physical and conceptual. So what it is, what it's called, where it came from, how big it is, etc. So over the next 10 or so slides, we'll look at some of those common attributes for most resource types. We'll start with title. So of course, title describes a resource, names a resource. It's what it's called. There are, however, different types of titles. There's, of course, the title proper, so the main title, say, for example, what you find on the title page of a book. There is subtitle or other subtitle information. You might also have parallel titles, so the title in another language. You might have titles of individual parts or sections of a resource, or various other types of variant titles, so spine titles, cover titles, and so on. Now, titles are, in a sense, straightforward. We know what they are, right? It's the name for the resource, but we can have some issues, such as where to find the title. Sure, the title page is there for print resources, but what about, say, web resources or other types of electronic resources? What is the main title versus other titles? How do we deal with inaccuracies or typos in the title? If you have to supply a title, what do you use? And what if there are, say, in the case of continuing resources, serials, what if there are changes in the title? At this slide here, we are looking at a few different examples of title statements. So in the library context, the title is usually transcribed from the resource itself, right? So a few examples here. The first one, we have a 245 from Mark, of course. So Eileen Ford's A More Beautiful You in 21 Days. Okay, that's a title. You might have a question about, say, where that introductory phrase, Eileen Ford, fits in. Is that a part of the title itself, or is that just telling us something about the author? Our second example, 245, Wood Cree and Le Cri des Forêts. Pardon my terrible French. This is an example of a parallel title. So this is a case where, say, on the title page, you have both English and French versions of the title. So in that case, we pick one that is the main title that goes in the 245, and the other goes in the 246 as an alternate title. Our third example, 245, Sleeping Beauty. So in this case, we have an example of a title with, again, an introductory phrase. So you can imagine, for example, on the cover of a DVD, it might read Disney Presents Sleeping Beauty. But Disney Presents, we might say it's not really properly part of the title, but if it's something that someone might search for, you might include it, again, in that alternate title field in that 246. And then at the bottom we have Heart of Darkness, but also Ethan Frome and Emma. So this is an example of a work without a collective title. So we have basically 3 novels that have been bound together, and we use the 700 fields to provide an author title added access point to each of those, so that even though we have to pick one thing to put in the 245, because the 245 is not repeatable in MARC, however, we can provide title access by those author title added entries in the 700 fields. On this slide, we are looking at a few more title examples from the non-library perspective. The first, actually these are both archives examples. The first is an example of a DAX record. DAX is the content standard, and EAD is the encoding standard that you're seeing an example of here. In the second example, it's still DAX again as the content standard, but MARC in this case is the encoding standard. So this is stressing that the content standard need not necessarily be bound to a single encoding standard. On this slide, a few more title examples. In this case, the first two are for web resources. In plain meta tags at the top of an HTML document, for example. For the first one, the second is an example of Dublin Core in HTML. And then at the bottom, we have some title examples from a museum context. So this would be using CCO or cataloging cultural objects as the content standard. And we have a couple of different types of title. So vase of flowers. You notice that it's qualified by title type, repository title. So what that means in a CCO record is that this was a supplied title, a cataloger supplied title, rather than something that was given to it by the author, or sorry, the artist. On the other hand, with Portrait of Thomas Jefferson, we have title type creator, and that means that that actually was the title that was given to it by the artist. Next, we're going to turn to edition or version information. So when we talk about an edition, we're talking about all of the identical copies of something offered to the public at the same time. So some issues that can come up with this. What words are used to indicate that? Are numbers used? Do we abbreviate that edition statement? What are editions called in other countries? Do new printings constitute a new edition? If we're talking about web resources, what is the new edition of a website? What is that? Does that even make sense, that question? What if it's a new edition but it's not called that? What if there are changes in responsibility for a new version? In all of these cases, usually this data is more or less transcribed from the resource itself. In the two examples on the slide, you'll notice there's an AACR2 version and a RDA version. A big difference between AACR2, the old cataloging rules, and the new ones in RDA is that under AACR2, we would abbreviate edition statements. So in this case, edition and revised are both abbreviated. Whereas you see in the second case, under RDA, we transcribe it exactly as it's given on the resource. Another primary area of description is dissemination information. So we're talking about, yes, publication, but also distribution, presentation, manufacturing, printing. So generally here we are concerned with where is it from, what company produced it, when was it made available. Place of publication or distribution or manufacture or printing is useful metadata for collocating resources by geographic region. So here too, of course, there are issues or questions that come up. If we have multiple places of publication, how many do we include? How much of the location do we include? Are we just talking about the city, or do we also, say, provide the state or the country? What about do we do in cases of unknown or probable places? Similarly with the publisher, whether we're talking about physical publishing or just presenting the resource on the web, we want to know who the responsible party is. So again, publisher, along with place of publication, is a core piece of the description. Issues here, similar to place of publication, things like multiple publishers, how much of the name to include, or do we abbreviate? What, again, if it's unknown or probable publisher. And then, of course, there are dates associated with dissemination information. Dates of publication, of course, but also copyright dates, which may or may not be the same. Creation date, if we're talking about electronic resources, access date or modification date. We could have, in other areas, broadcast dates. And, of course, there's always the situation where maybe you don't know the date or it's an uncertain date. So dates in particular can be difficult. Dates can be confounding to the organizer. When we can, usually this data is transcribed from the resource itself. And you will notice on the slide the first three examples are all MARC examples. Using the first two are 264 fields. 264 second indicator 1, that is for a publication statement. 264 second indicator 3, on the other hand, is for a manufacture statement. Those are both new fields that were kind of came along with RDA. In older records that you might see that were created under AACR2, you will, instead of the 264, see a 260 field, as in the third example. That was sort of the old basic dissemination information field that we had, but it wasn't really capable of differentiating between all these different functions in the same way, such as publication, copyright, presentation, manufacturing, etc. We have two examples then in using Dublin Core, and then finally at the end an example of somewhat vaguer dates, right? We don't always have a specific year. We could have early 16th century or a range of dates, right, between 1500 and 1530. And I should say that last example is from CCO. I neglected to say that. It's a museum example. Our next area we're going to talk about is physical description. So we are always concerned with the physical description of a resource, whether we're talking about books or DVDs or manuscripts, collections of records, works of art, objects, images, whether those are physical or digital. Usually this is metadata that is created by the organizer, so it's cataloger generated. Of course, the physical description of a resource is going to vary quite a bit depending on the type of material that we're describing. So a video will have different characteristics from a still image. A website in an archival collection will have different needs for description. The different attributes of concern can include things like how many, so how many pages, how many documents, how many boxes or volumes or items, or in a different sense, what is the playing time? How big is it if it's a physical object? What are the dimensions or measurements? What does it look like and sound like? So we're talking about colors, sound characteristics, illustrations, materials or techniques used to create the thing. What type of resource is it in a very basic sense? So talking about things like content, carrier, media type, format, and so on. And there are, of course, problematic areas in physical description as well. So, for example, if we're talking about non-corporeal resources or electronic resources, what do we do for those? And in general, for anything, how much detail do we include? That'll vary by the type of material and the content standard that you're using. So on this slide, the first two examples are again from MARC. So the 300 field is the standard field for physical description. Of course, in the 300 field, we can have pages for a book, but also MARC can be used to describe all kinds of things. So in the second case, you've got what must have been a record for a hand puppet, right? And in subfield E in the 300 field is actually for accompanying materials. So the teacher's booklet, which is 14 pages, is being treated as sort of secondary material here. The main thing being described is the hand puppet itself. And then following that, we have a couple of examples in using Dublin Core to give information about an electronic document. So again, that format information, like it is text rather than image, or it is HTML rather than a PDF or a Word document. This goes into kind of this physical description area, this format area as well. Third example is from the archives world, or pardon me, from the archives world here, where of course we might measure things not in number of pages, but rather in terms of linear feet or cubic feet. And then the final example here, we have a couple of examples from, again, the museum world, giving dimensions and materials and techniques for a work of art. Next up, we have creator information. So not only do we describe the resource itself, but we're also concerned with those responsible for its creation. So that means we need to understand who or what is responsible for creating a resource. For this type of metadata, we're interested in identifying and listing the persons, families, corporate bodies responsible for the creation of a work, or those who have contributed to an expression, to put it in further terms. That could be at another level. So not only, as in on the slide here, creators such as primary creators, that is, such as authors, composers, artists, and so on, but also those on the contributor or expression level, things like editors, translators, illustrations, etc. Now, usually, this is transcribed data to a certain extent, although some communities also use the data to create authority-controlled access points. This is the case definitely in libraries, but also in archives and museums. That's not what we're talking about tonight. We're going to be talking about authority-controlled access points in the next unit, actually in a couple of weeks. But even ignoring access points for now, this is the area, creator information, where we will have things like the creation of statements of responsibility, or simply identifying the responsible parties. There, of course, may be more than one responsible party in the creation of a work. In the past, we have not always included every party included in the creation of a work in our descriptions. This is in part related to the fact that we, a lot of our descriptor rules originated with things like catalog cards, which have limited space on them. So there used to be rules about how many creators to include if there were multiple ones. But this is something that is changing. So on this slide here, we have a few creator examples in MARC. The first example at the top is a relatively straightforward example where we have an author, Mrs. M. Grieve, and we also have the editor. Okay, so the main author is going to get a 100 field, whereas the editor, who is really a contributor to the expression rather than a creator of the work, is going to go in a 700 field as an added access point. Second example here, Sandition by Jane Austen and Another Lady. Whoever is being identified as the main author here, the primary author, which need not be the first mentioned author, will go in the 100 field. This is sort of an unusual authorized access point. Of course, Another Lady is not really a first name, last name type of name, but you can get sort of unusual things when people are known by these sort of anonymous pseudonyms. And then in this particular case, Jane Austen goes in a 700 field as a secondary author. And in the final example here, we have information resources on avian influenza, compiled and edited by Richard Crawford, Deanna Jensen, and Barbara Buchanan. So in this particular case, this is a case in which there's no single party who's primarily responsible here. All of these people are editors rather than authors, so each of them gets a 700 access point, and also, in this particular case, we have a 710, which is an added access point for a corporate body, which happens to be the sponsoring body in this case. So, of course, not only personal names, individual persons, but also corporate bodies can be creators or contributors. A few more examples here. This is kind of giving you some examples of what I mentioned before of how we used to not necessarily include all of the named authors when there were many. So this is for the same resource, both of these. However, the first is under AACR2 and the second is under RDA. So it used to be under AACR2 that if you had, in this case, 4 added authors, you would only record the first of those, and you would then do this ellipses and et al. For et alia or and others to indicate that yes, there were other ones, but we're not telling you who they are. Again, think of this as being sort of a remnant of card catalog days and that need for space. Of course, we're not cataloging for card catalogs anymore, so we don't really need to do that, and that's one of the changes that is, I think, pretty universally appreciated with RDA, is that now we can include all of them. So each of them in this case gets a 700 field as an author. And then finally, we also at the very bottom have just an example of a statement of responsibility that is specifically being associated with a edition as opposed to with the main title. So for example, you might imagine if the first through fourth editions of this work were created by somebody else and we have a change in responsibility with specifically the fifth edition. A few more creator examples here. We've got a number of Dublin Core examples at the very top. You see there is both an element in Dublin Core for creator, but also for contributor. Those are two separate elements to indicate that difference in responsibility. We have an example from DAX coming next, encoded in EAD with our swine influenza example here, okay? And this is another example of a case where a corporate body, in this case the Minnesota Department of Health, can be treated as the main creator. The third example here is also a DAX example, so also an archives example, but in this case we're not looking at EAD encoding. Instead, we're just looking at the print that might just be used in a basic finding aid, so human readable rather than machine readable, okay? In this case, we're identifying 3 different people that were collectors of, that contributed to the creation of this particular collection. Oh, pardon me, the first 2 are collectors, the third is the author because this is a collection of Lincoln materials. And then finally, we have 2 examples from CCO, Cataloging Cultural Objects. The first is with a known, sort of straightforward known creator, and his role specified, so it's a painter. Second, we have an unknown artist, okay, which is something that you can imagine how a set of cataloging rules for art collections in particular, you would need to have ways of accounting for that type of unknown creator. I'm going to move on now to content description. So this area of metadata deals with the intellectual and creative contents of a work. It addresses what the resource is about and what it is. So this can include classification numbers and also subject headings. So those are 2 different types of controlled data to represent what something's about. But you could also, of course, have keywords. You could have free text supplied by the organizer. Tables of contents also get at content, right? As well as scope and content notes in the archives arena. So these are both, well, in the second case, this is archivist supplied data. Summaries and abstracts, these can be part of content description, either transcribed from some source or composed by the organizer. In Dublin Core, there are a couple of different elements that tend to get at content description. There's description, that's the name of the element, which is a free text content description element. There's also coverage, which is for describing the geographical or chronological sort of description of the resource. Genre and form also get at content description. In this case, it's not what it is, sorry, pardon me, I just flipped that. It's not what it's about, it's what the thing is, okay, what genre or form the thing is. We're not going to spend a ton of time on these examples because in a few weeks we'll be addressing these issues of content description and subject analysis in much more depth, but I wanted to show you a few examples. So here are some examples from the library world. So at the top we have an LC call number, we have a Dewey class number, we have a subject heading with several subdivisions, monkeys, pardon me, a handbook on monkeys in Paris, France, in case you ever need to find that. We have a genre form heading, novelty films in a 655, which is the tag number 4, genre and form terms. But we also, in addition to those controlled fields, we have a couple of non-controlled fields. So we have a 520, which is for a summary. We also have a 505, which is a table of contents. So all of these, in different ways, are ways of getting at content descriptions. This slide here is showing 4 elements from the Dublin Core element set that address content issues. Of course, subject obviously gets at content issues. Language does in a way as well, because this is the language in which the thing is expressed. And of course, also those coverage elements that I mentioned earlier, both temporal coverage, so 1995 to 1996, and also Boston MA, so geographic coverage. And then there is the description element itself, where you can give sort of a free text expression describing or summarizing a resource. Here are a few content examples from the archives world. So we have scope and content notes, narrative descriptions of what will be found in the archival collection. We have an example of an abstract for the collection, which is somewhat shorter than typically your scope and contents note will be. And then we also have subject headings that are relevant to the work. So as you can see, LCSH and other controlled vocabularies are not just used in libraries, but they're used in archives as well. And you may end up having quite a few subject headings for a collection, far more than you would have on a typical book record. But of course, note that classification number is not here, and that's because typically archives are not open stacks, so we don't usually have a classification number that reflects the subject to organize things. This slide is showing a few examples from the museum and visual resources world. So we have first subject. So we've got several keywords or phrases describing the resource's content. Note that we have some concrete visual images that appear in the work, right? Still life, flowers, urn, ledge. But we also have some themes and motifs too, right? We have death, the senses, vanitas, passion of Christ, right? So notice how these subject terms are really on several different levels of description here, right? We also have culture, so the origins and influences of the work. This gets at content issues. And also style, so referring to the aspects of the visual appearance of a work of art that relate it to other works by the same artist or from the same period or training or location or school of art movement. And then finally we have description, so a narrative bit of text explaining the work, which may be created by the cataloger, but it also may come from another source, a reference source of some kind. Another area of core description is relationships and contextual information. So this can include things like series that the work might belong to, any accompanying material, details related to the publication history, numbering in context to other issues of a serial or items in a series. And in archives, of course, we might have all kinds of other types of relationship or contextual information. So things like biographical information, corporate histories, provenance information, and so on. And of course, relationships and contextual information can be addressed in notes of various kinds, both those sort of pre-selected for a certain type of contextual information, or just sort of generic notes like the 500 field in a MARC record. And then finally, we get down to the level of item-specific data. So we're talking about here things that, say, differentiate one item from another. So this might be things like call number, or location information, or accession information, accession numbers, or URLs, or shelf locations, and so on. We might also have things like notes on specific items, like say that this is an autographed copy, or this copy is damaged in one way or another, or it's missing pages, or it's been bound with another work, and so on. All of these would be examples of item-specific data. So that takes us to the end of our sort of review of kind of core areas of description and some examples from different metadata schemas. I will see you next week in class when we continue with Dublin Core and RDA.